A joke of an election titled Significant Chunks of Both the Cathedral and the Dissident Media. Now, imagine the United States electing Ronnie Cox as president because he played a fictional president in multiple films and he kinda looked cool on the screen. Well, that's basically what Ukraine did, but slightly worse. I mean, at least Ronnie Cox can speak proper English, while the president-elect Volodymyr Zelensky kinda struggles with the national language of the country he is supposed to rule starting from next month and until 2024, presumably. Now, how did this happen? And who is this guy anyway? What lessons can be drawn from this? Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. Alright, so I happened to be in Ukraine over the last sprint of the election campaign for the second round of the presidential race, meaning that I got to observe from the field how this election was fought in the flyover regions of Zakarpatska, Chernivtsi and Khmelnytsky. As mentioned in the previous video, I got overwhelmingly depressive weather for the whole week in Ukraine, so I don't have much footage from this trip, but the one that I do have is mostly from two castles, Khotin and Kamyanets-Podilsky, two castles residing on the opposite sides of what used to be the border between the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and the Principality of Moldova, well, until the Russians fucked it up for everyone towards the end of the 18th century. In any event, if I run out of footage from this trip, I'll go into my vast personal archive of Ukraine footage that I never published, so don't worry, there's plenty of nice things to put on the screen while I talk about this very serious and not exactly nice topic of most of the Ukrainian electorate opting to put literally a comedian as a head of state. So, take a seat and enjoy the footage because this clusterfuck is not exactly easy to explain and it will take a while. So, a comedian won the presidency in Ukraine. Of course, various pundits and NPCs from the cathedral media rushed to compare this election with Brexit and Trump and Bolsonaro because, as we've become accustomed by now, any election that doesn't go in the direction wanted by the radical far leftist faction in the cathedral has to be about populism and Trump. Because reasons. The reality, though, was and is a lot more nuanced than what both the Russian and the former Western Bloc press would want you to believe. By and large, the more serious Russian media presented Volodymyr Alexandrovich Zelensky as much more friendly to Russian interests, which is a dubious claim, a much-needed change, also a dubious claim, and a populist leader, an outright false claim. The Western media took the Russian one at its word about the populist part and repeated that claim like the good NPCs that they all are, not bothering once to at least fly one of their NPCs and just walk down the streets of any Ukrainian city, not Kyiv or Lviv. If they had done that, the populism claim would have fallen to pieces immediately, but that would mean doing real journalism, which is hard. Copy-pasting the claims of the Kremlin while accusing others of being Russian shills is a lot easier. In addition to the populist claim, the Western media also portrayed Mr. Zelensky as an inexperienced buffoon, and France 24 called the vote for the comedian as a leap into the unknown, both claims having a superficial relationship with reality. All in all, lack of nuance was the absolute standard in most of the cathedral, both in the West and in the Russian one, when it came to the comedian who is now waiting patiently to assume the office of the presidency in this country. Much to my shock, some of the most balanced coverage was offered by BuzzFeed News, whose article, "He plays a president on TV, now he wants to be the real deal," is astonishingly nuanced and distinctly lacking in hysteria. Not surprisingly, the article has 0 comments and hasn't been read by many people. So, how things really did go down? Well, to answer that, a bit of background history is needed. As you all know, present-day Ukraine has two big unsolved issues: the aggression by Russia and the promises of the Euromaidan revolution. Both of these are connected to the incumbent Petro Poroshenko. The Russian aggression started in the aftermath of the Euromaidan revolution, and Petro Poroshenko was basically the Euromaidan candidate, since his TV channel was the one that popularized and offered the most thorough reporting of the events, in addition to bankrolling some of the protests. The problem is that the electorate got tired over the last 5 years. One aspect that is rarely spoken about is that being in a state of war, even if no actual violence has been occurring anywhere in the country for more than 3 years now, but simply being in a state of war and constantly be reminded of that every step of the way for 5 years, that tends to make people mentally tired, or induce mental fatigue, if you prefer a more scientific term. Basically, at some point, enough people say, you know what, enough with this shit, when do we start living again? And this is true of any people anywhere in the world. The same has happened in the United States with the Vietnam War, which ended up with the electorate putting in a president that politically lost the war, even though logistically it had been won. A similar thing appears to be happening in South Korea as we speak. A very similar thing happened in Sudan, which led to the separation into two countries. In other words, this is a constant flaw in human nature when we're talking about large groups such as nations or countries. Now, managing that is a task that few have succeeded in. It is possible, but it is rare at the scale of civilizational history, regardless of the continent or century we're talking about. The Petro Poroshenko administration was, therefore, within the historical standard. It did what it could do, made some mistakes along the way, and generally failed to manage the collective mental fatigue. And some of those mistakes proved to be quite relevant. The media cited the education law and the generalized corruption as examples, but that's missing the point. If the electorate had been so pissed off about corruption, then surely they would have opted for a candidate not backed by an oligarch. So definitely not Zelensky, who was and is backed in all respects by Igor Kolomoisky, who not only produces the current president's show, but is basically the political oligarch in the country. There is only one person in Ukraine richer than him, Rinat Akhmetov, known outside of Ukraine mostly for his football club, the 2009 UEFA Cup winners Shakhtar Donetsk. So it wasn't the corruption and it wasn't the education law either. The biggest mistakes of the Petro Poroshenko administration were the refusal of further decentralization and the economy, even though he himself was the one who started the effort to decentralize the leadership of the country. Now, those who favored the incumbent argued that further decentralization in times of war is not the brightest idea, and on economics, they argue that the state has already reformed its approach in ways unimaginable before 2014, and these things take time until they're noticeable in the pockets of most of the people, especially in a country territorially large as Ukraine is. Now, these are perfectly reasonable arguments, but not exactly convincing. Now, why is that? Well, it's because that's not where the people are at this point. You see, when virtually 100% of the electorate has seen with their own eyes how much good a sudden and radical change can bring, and I'm talking here about the Maidan, they start to think that the solution to many problems can be a radical and sudden change, and that experimenting is not only permitted, but recommended. Civilizationally speaking, this is a terrible mistake, but it's a mistake almost every young democracy has committed at least once, and it was definitely the standard in the mid-1990s in most of the Intermarium. The problem is that the mistakes committed in other parts of the Intermarium 20 to 25 years ago ended up inflicting marginal consequences, while this time, at this point in the history of Ukraine, it doesn't seem to be going the same way. Now, I sure hope I will be proven wrong, and most definitely will be studying this topic in autumn, so I will suspend judgment or further judgment in this direction for the time being. So, in this context of mental fatigue, perceived inefficient and stubborn administration, and the feeling that some more radical changes are perfectly possible, in this context, Volodymyr Zelensky emerges. His TV show, Sluga Narodu, Servant of the People, paid for by the oligarch Igor Kolomoisky, as mentioned earlier, debuted in 2015, and the plot of it is basically like this. A school teacher goes into a rant in the classroom about rampant corruption, and the student records that rant and puts it on the internet, and the video goes viral. Soon after, the school teacher runs for president and wins. The show had little importance in 2015, but by 2018 it became quite relevant after enough people saw that it is possible for one man to turn the entrenched establishment upside down, or at the very least successfully create the impression of that. Also, by 2018, Igor Kolomoisky, the patron of Mr. Zelensky, had himself been embroiled in multiple direct conflicts with the Poroshenko administration. Whether rightfully so or not, it doesn't really matter. None of the Zelensky voters I talked with seemed to care about the details and outright stated that the truth about such details don't matter. And this is where many analysts, including myself prior to the April trip to Ukraine, have got it wrong, or at the very least half wrong. After the first round, in which Zelensky got 30% of the vote to only 16% of the incumbent, Brian Mefford, a Ukraine-based consultant for the Atlantic Council, was writing, quote, "Zelensky's candidacy is a classic protest vote. The first round gives the voters a chance to register their disapproval, but in a runoff, when the vote really matters, voters may re-evaluate their support for Zelensky." Well, that was wrong too, and Mr. Mefford should have seen it if he's based in Ukraine. I saw it after the second day in the field. The reason that assessment was wrong is because it fails to consider the third candidate, Yulia Tymoshenko. And here comes another parenthesis. I hope you can follow. Told you this is a clusterfuck. So, for those who haven't been following Ukrainian politics that much, Yulia Tymoshenko is a former prime minister at the middle of the last decade, serving 2 terms in 2005 and from 2007 to 2010. She rose to prominence with the 2004 Orange Revolution, which she co-led when Viktor Yushchenko became president after a rerun of the runoff ordered by the Supreme Court. Since then, Yulia Tymoshenko has consistently been a thorn in the eye of every big figure. Even though Yushchenko's presidency was mostly a failure, his girl, as the press at the time called Yulia Tymoshenko, amassed a lot of political capital for herself, and in 2010 she narrowly lost in the presidential runoff against the bad Viktor Yanukovych, a name you surely heard a lot in 2014, as it's the president ousted in the Maidan and currently exiled in Russia. Now, after losing the 2010 bid, Yulia Tymoshenko became embroiled in multiple corruption scandals and was criminally prosecuted in 2011, and she was sentenced to 7 years in jail for embezzlement, fraud, abuse of power, and other similar crimes. Now, many pundits have speculated that the case was a smear campaign and it was primarily politically motivated. And there is some truth to that. In any event, in the aftermath of the Maidan revolution, she was released and rehabilitated, and as a reward, she ran against Petro Poroshenko, who was mainly responsible for the Maidan revolution existing in the first place. Now, she lost in a landslide, but remained an active member of the parliament and of the opposition. As the Petro Poroshenko had gone through the usual process of erosion that any leader goes through anywhere in the world, she had hoped to take his spot in the runoff. So Petro Poroshenko in the first round had to fight more to keep Yulia Tymoshenko away than to fight against Volodymyr Zelensky. Poroshenko won that fight, but by the time the distance between himself and the upstart comedian was already too big to be recovered. But this detail of the side fight with Yulia Tymoshenko is perhaps the decisive factor on why the incumbent lost. In a sane world, the incumbent would have fought Tymoshenko in the runoff, but democracy is not about sanity, but about votes. Alright, so now that you have a decent context, now we can talk about the winner. So, we're now in April 10 or April 11th, about 10 days before the election, and Zelensky leads in the polls by a margin in excess of 3-1. Most of the energy has been spent on the bitter fight against Yulia Tymoshenko, while Zelensky benefited from the fact that his popular TV show had just returned with a new season. So basically, free TV campaign ads and free propaganda in ways and at a scale that Trump or Jair Bolsonaro couldn't even begin to imagine. As I mentioned at the beginning, Zelensky's command of the Ukrainian language is approximate, to put it mildly, so large rallies with a populist slant were completely out of question. Not to mention that the weather was mostly terrible. The novelty, and some would argue the winning strategy in Zelensky's campaign, stood in the fact that the comedian simply avoided the cathedral media, thus limiting any potential exposure that he could not control. Instead, he relied on an almost 24/7 presence on social media and very carefully scripted rants. The media kept on insisting that his policy positions are unclear, but after talking with Zelensky voters myself and studying the Zelensky campaign, it doesn't seem he was that unclear at all. On all the topics of interest, he doesn't fundamentally differ from either Poroshenko or Yulia Tymoshenko, and he or his handlers knew that. He had to differentiate himself by something else rather than policy positions. If you want a description by Western standards, Zelensky is a slightly more socially progressive version of Poroshenko, but only slightly more. Now keep in mind that this is a country where progressivism is associated either with Bolshevism or with lunatics who cut down crosses, so being openly a progressive in Ukraine is basically political suicide. Now, critics of Zelensky, or if you want, overzealous shills of the incumbent, tried really hard to paint the comedian as a Russian puppet. At some point in the campaign, the Poroshenko team picked up on this argument, and signs like the one you're looking at right now started appearing all over the country. For those who only listen, the sign says that on April the 21st there is a decisive choice, and the photo depicts Mr. Poroshenko, the incumbent, and Vladimir Putin, with the clear implication that the vote for Mr. Zelensky is a vote for Vladimir Putin. The argument for that position was and is pretty thin, namely that Russia's best hope was for someone not Poroshenko to win the election, in the hope it will be a less harsh on Russia leadership. The reason I say that argument is thin is because prima facie there was no such option, but time will tell. For now, Mr. Zelensky appears to be willing to troll Vladimir Putin just like he trolled Poroshenko and trolled himself into the presidency. The problem is that it takes a lot more than witty trolling to deal with Vladimir Putin. At the end of the day, under Poroshenko, Ukrainian control was re-established in the east. In most domains, the reforms have progressed and the economic liberalization has slowly started to show results. Yes, not fast enough for way too many people, but is that a good enough reason to conduct radical experiments literally in times of war? Well, a bit over 13.5 million Ukrainians thought that it's worth the risk. In the end, the argument of change at any cost won out against the prudent but fatiguing message of patience and persistence. Radio Free Europe in Romanian concluded, quote, Ukraine offered a grandiose spectacle of a democratic exercise, but the results pose the risk of a disaster for a country de facto still at war with Russia, unquote. Now, while Zelensky may not be the absolute incompetent idiot in terms of politics, like the media and even some of his own voters believe him to be, it is reasonable to be wary precisely because the geopolitical context of the country is one that is a lot less tolerant with such experiments than other countries were over the last 4 or 5 years of experiments. The good news is that Ukraine is not a full-fledged presidential republic, but rather a semi-presidential one, which means that the head of the government is the prime minister, who is appointed by the president but with the consent of the parliament. And in the parliament, the majority is held by the political party called the Petro Poroshenko bloc. So there's that. At least of an equal importance will be the parliamentary elections, which will be held in late October of this year, 4 months into Mr. Zelensky's term. At this point, Zelensky's party, named after his TV show, does poll at about 25% and should, in theory, be the largest political bloc in the next parliament. But it's a long period between now and October 27, and polling at 25% can mean getting as much as 30% of the seats or as little as 18% of the seats. It does depend where your voters are, as Ukraine uses a parallel voting system to elect the parliament. The parallel voting system means that a portion, usually half of the parliament, is elected under a proposed proportional representation party list system, similar to how it's done in Germany, for instance, but with a single nationwide consistency, and the rest is elected under a first-past-the-post system, like it is done in the United Kingdom with territorial constituencies. This is a good balance, thus preventing situations where a party can poll as high as 10% nationally and still get 0 seats in a general election. But this also means that it is no guarantee that polling at 25%, like Zelensky's party right now, means you get a quarter of the seats in the next parliament. So the new president already has quite a few complicated tasks from now till late October. First, don't do anything controversial that would harm the party, or else he'll be alone and isolated by the parliament, which happened before, by the way. Second, get good counseling on the most important appointees, such as the Minister of Defense, Minister of Internal Affairs, the General Prosecutor or the Attorney General, and perhaps the most important, the head of the Security Service, the SBU. And third, don't troll too much. Any misstep in this department could throw the hryvnia into turmoil and financially ruin at least half of the country, especially the half that voted and shilled for him the most. And these 3 tasks are just for the next 5 weeks. Then comes the more difficult part, but those will be the topic of another video, likely after another trip to observe in the field. So, to sum it up, Volodymyr Zelensky won because the incumbent quite simply neglected large swaths of the electorate in the feelings department and, like many leaders in many countries throughout history, failed to manage the mental fatigue, which is an unavoidable reality when prolonged military sieges or territory disputes exist. If there's one thing the media, both the Western one and the Russian one, got right, is this: April 21st was not a victory of Volodymyr Zelensky, but a loss of Petro Poroshenko. The media got the reasons wrong, but at least they got the picture on what happened. Hey, that counts too. I mean, all that's right about populism is just more unoriginal background noise by the cathedral. And it comes not just because most of the cathedral is brazenly partisan without the decency of at least acknowledging it, but it also comes because increasingly the cathedral doesn't even try to understand things anymore, which is part of the reason their propaganda is increasingly in the low-quality bait territory. Of course, the media will do what the media will do, but if there is any lesson to be drawn from the April 21st Ukrainian election, that lesson is this: change at any cost for the sake of change can sometimes be a bloody powerful argument, even if it is not reasonable. Political operatives and pundits should bear that in mind when they proclaim that reason will prevail or some similar claptrap. No, it won't, at least not always, and pretending otherwise is foolish. Also, everyone should study more about human nature and gain some wisdom on that. This election campaign has shown, to me at least, why field research is so damn important. If I hadn't done this trip, I would have probably avoided speaking about this, or would have scheduled a post-election trip. One thing is certain though, the likelihood of a moderate outcome from the presidency of a comedian whose sole experience is playing a fictional president in a TV show is very low. The best case scenario is that he admits he doesn't know what he's doing, appoints a not terrible prime minister, and lets the quasi-technocratic government do the rest. The worst case scenario is that he tries to deliver, in the process wrecking the economy and pissing off the voters the way Yushchenko did 10 to 15 years ago. And if this happens, then don't be surprised if this spins out into more experiments in 2024. Of course, these two best and worst case scenarios, there are degrees. There is also the very cynical view that I heard, including from several of his own voters, namely that he'll be entirely the puppet of Igor Kolomoisky. That's surely a distinct possibility, though a lot less likely than many would dare to think, simply because reality doesn't work like the conspiracy theories in YouTube comment sections or in the forums. In reality, even puppets start demanding shit at some point in time, and Zelensky may be low on knowledge in terms of politics, but he's not an NPC and should not be underestimated that much. Ultimately, I really do hope the worst predictions end up being wrong, but the way I know my Ukraine, at least some of the bad will have to happen. We will know a lot more by the end of September though, not just because I'll take another trip then, but also because by that time the new president will have had the occasion to provide at least a sample of his style. If it's anything like we've seen in the show, let's just say you should sell your hryvnias now and buy a lot more with the same dollars later on. But to end in a positive note, there have been multiple examples in recent history when unlikely leaders ended up being great, or at the very least nowhere near as terrible as they looked on paper at the time of their ascension to power. It's just that the challenges are far too serious for a total novice. But then again, everyone was a novice at some point. We'll see what happens, as President Trump, another novice, is fond of saying. After all, you don't come to Freedom Alternative for definitive pronouncements, especially on delicate and fast-changing issues like these, where there is no room for definitive pronouncements, not if the aim is nuanced and grounded in reality anyway. So, what do you all think? Was the election of Zelensky a good idea? Why or why not? Let's keep the conversation going for a while and then we'll compare notes several months from now. The goal is to get better at these things because in June, at the 3 Seas Initiative Summit, surely the Zelensky question will come up, and we will be there to document that too, and perhaps to pose these questions, whether on or off camera, to various leaders and businessmen in the intermarium. Whether we like it or not, the political and economical situation in Ukraine matters quite a lot, and the election of Zelensky just made Ukraine a lot more relevant for the rest of 2019, so do expect a lot more of this kind of content, as we'll be bringing it up both in the upcoming German tour, but also in the Polish tour later on this year. So, with all of that being said, thank you all for watching, thank you for your consistent and generous support. Please do consider a donation if you derive any value from the work being done here. None of this comes free. Do visit our website, subscribe to our Telegram group and the Discord server, and I will see you all soon on the Freedom Alternative.